The whisper beneath the fog. It was upon a bitter evening in November, when the London fog lay thick as wool upon the streets and muffled even the sharpest of sounds, that the curious affair of the shadow in the alley first entered my life. I recall with particular clarity the stillness of Baker Street that night, broken only by the occasional clatter of a distant hansom cab and the faint hiss of gas lamps struggling against the damp air. Sherlock Holmes sat opposite me, long limbs drawn inward, his keen eyes half closed as though in idle meditation. Yet I knew well that such stillness in my friend was but a deceptive veil, for his mind was never at rest. A chemical apparatus bubbled faintly upon the side table, casting a pale blue glow that danced across his angular features. "You observe, Watson," said he suddenly, without opening his eyes, "that our visitor is not merely delayed, but conflicted." I looked up from my notes. "Visitor? You expect someone?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I expect someone who has already resolved thrice to come, and thrice turned back before reaching our door. His footsteps have passed this street no fewer than 4 times within the last half-hour." I rose and peered through the curtain. "I see nothing but fog." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "And yet if you had Holmesian ears, you would have detected hesitation in the rhythm of those unseen steps." Before I could reply, there came a sudden, sharp knock upon the door, urgent, yet restrained as though the caller feared both entry and retreat in equal measure. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps echoed faintly below, followed by the creak of the door and a murmur of voices. Moments later our visitor was shown in. He was a man of perhaps 35 years, though anxiety had etched deeper lines upon his face. His coat was of fine quality but poorly fastened, and his hat trembled slightly in his hand. His eyes darted about the room before settling upon Holmes with an expression of desperate relief. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, his voice low and strained, "I have been told you are the last hope for men who stand upon the brink of ruin." Holmes gestured calmly toward a chair. "Pray sit, sir. You have already worn a path along Baker Street in your indecision. It would be a pity to retreat now." The man stared, astonished. How could you possibly?" "My dear sir," Holmes interrupted gently, "your boots carry the damp chalk of the eastern pavement which lies some distance from your present lodging. Your coat is unbuttoned, despite the cold suggesting agitation rather than neglect. And your gloves note, Watson, the right glove is reversed indicate that it has been removed and replaced repeatedly in nervous hesitation. These are the habits of a man who debates a grave matter within himself." The visitor sank into the chair as though his strength had deserted him. "My name is Edward Markham," he said, "and I am being followed." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Followed? By whom?" "That is precisely the horror of it I do not know. Or rather—" he hesitated. "I know only what I have seen, and what I have seen defies reason." Holmes's eyes sharpened, the languor vanishing instantly. "Proceed, Mr. Markham. You will find that reason has a most persistent way of asserting itself, even where it appears absent." Markham drew a shaky breath. "It began 3 nights ago," he said. "I had been returning from my office near Holborn somewhat later than usual. The fog was thick much like tonight, and I took a short cut through an alley I have used 100 times before." "A common error," Holmes murmured. "I had nearly reached the far end," Markham continued, "when I became aware of a presence behind me. Not footsteps, no, that would have been ordinary enough, but something quieter, a movement without sound. I confess that I felt a slight chill at his words, though I endeavored to conceal it. I turned," he said, "and saw nothing. The alley was empty. Yet I was certain, utterly certain, that I was not alone." Holmes made no comment, though I noticed the faintest narrowing of his eyes. "I resumed my pace," Markham went on, "but had not gone 10 steps when I saw it." "What did you see?" I asked. He looked directly at me, his face pale. "A shadow, Dr. Watson, but not one cast by any visible object." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Describe it." "It was elongated," said Markham slowly, as though reliving the moment, "darker than the surrounding gloom, and moving against the direction of the gaslight. It stretched along the wall beside me, keeping pasno, not merely keeping pace, but matching my movements exactly, though there was nothing to cast it." "And the source of light?" Holmes asked. "A single gas lamp at the far end of the alley." "Behind you or before you?" "Before me." Holmes nodded faintly. "Go on." "I stopped," said Markham, "and the shadow stopped. I moved my arm, and it moved as well, but not precisely. There was a delay, a fraction of a second, perhaps but enough to convince me that it was not my own." "Did you hear anything?" "Nothing. That was the worst of it. No sound whatsoever. "I ran," Markham said simply. "I ran until I reached the main street, where there were people and light. When I turned again, the shadow was gone." Holmes rose and began to pace slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "And this occurred only once?" he asked. "No," said Markham, his voice tightening. "It has happened every night since. Always the same alley. Always the same— And yet you continue to take this route?" Markham flushed. "I wished to prove to myself that it was imagination, that I was not losing my senses." Holmes stopped abruptly. "A commendable desire," said he, "though perhaps not the safest method of satisfying it. I could not restrain myself. Have you spoken of this to the police?" Markham gave a bitter laugh. "I did. They suggested fatigue or perhaps an overactive imagination. One inspector advised me to avoid ghost stories before bed." Holmes's lips twitched slightly. "Yes, that is very much in keeping with the methods of Scotland Yard," he said. Markham leaned forward urgently. "But there is more," he said. Last night it came closer." Holmes's expression did not change, but I felt a distinct tightening in the air. "In what manner?" "I stopped as before," said Markham, "and the shadow did not stop immediately. It continued forward just a step before halting." Holmes's eyes flashed. "And then," Markham whispered, "it raised an arm." "Indeed?" "An arm, though there was nothing there, and it pointed directly at me." A silence fell upon the room, broken only by the faint bubbling of Holmes's chemical experiment. "And what did you do?" I asked. "I fled," said Markham, "but I could not escape the feeling that it was not merely following me, but studying me." Holmes resumed his seat, his expression now one of intense concentration. "My dear Mr. Markham," said he, "your case is most intriguing. You have done wisely to come here. Then you believe me?" Markham asked eagerly. "I believe," said Holmes, "that what you have experienced has a cause. Whether that cause be natural or otherwise remains to be seen. But I assure you of this, there is no phenomenon so strange that it cannot be examined by reason." Markham exhaled in relief. "Will you take the case?" Holmes glanced at me briefly, and I saw that familiar spark in his is the one that signaled the beginning of an intellectual hunt. "With the greatest pleasure," said he. "Watson, we shall have occasion to visit this alley of yours tonight." I confess that the prospect did not fill me with enthusiasm. "Tonight," I said. "Assuredly," Holmes replied, "for it is in darkness that shadows reveal their secrets." He turned back to Markham. "You will accompany us, of course. But until then you must follow my instructions precisely. Avoid the alley. Speak to no one of this matter. And above all," he paused, his gaze sharpening, "observe everything." Markham nodded, though I could see that fear still lingered in his eyes. As our visitor departed into the fog, I turned to Holmes. "You do not truly suspect anything supernatural?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson," said he, "the moment one admits the supernatural, one abandons the game. No, this is a puzzle, and I have long found that the most unsettling puzzles are those which appear, at first glance, to defy explanation." He reached for his coat and hat. "The night is young, and London's shadows are waiting." Thus began one of the most singular and disquieting cases it has ever been my lot to record, a case in which even the keenest intellect I have ever known was, for a time, confronted by something that seemed to exist just beyond the edge of reason itself. The man who noticed too much. It has often been my observation that Sherlock Holmes, in the intervals between his cases, would engage himself in pursuits so trivial in appearance that they might mislead a casual observer into underestimating his faculties. Yet such diversions were never without purpose. Indeed, they formed the very foundation upon which his remarkable powers of deduction were built. On the morning following Mr. Edward Markham's extraordinary visit, I found Holmes already awake and fully dressed, seated by the window with a violin resting idly across his knee. The fog had lifted somewhat, revealing a pale and reluctant sun struggling through the London haze. "You are late, Watson," said he without turning. I glanced at the clock. "It is scarcely past 8. "Precisely," Holmes replied. "And you are late by 43 minutes. I smiled. "Then I presume you have been occupied with something of interest?" Holmes gestured toward the street below. "A most instructive exercise," said he. "Pray, join me." I stepped beside him and followed his gaze. A small cluster of activity had gathered near the opposite pavement. A tradesman argued loudly with a constable, while a woman stood nearby wringing her hands. "A disagreement over payment?" I ventured. Holmes chuckled softly. "My dear Watson, you see but you do not observe. Allow me to illustrate." He leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. "The tradesman, you note, carries a crate marked with the insignia of a well-known tea importer. yet his boots are caked with dry clay, not the damp residue one would expect from the docks. Therefore the crate is not recently acquired." "Then it has been tampered with?" I asked. "Precisely. Furthermore, the constable's posture observed the angle of his shoulders indicates not authority but uncertainty. He has been called after the dispute escalated, not before. And the woman?" Holmes smiled faintly. "The woman is the key. Her gloves are mismatched, and her apron bears a faint stain of tea spilled recently, judging by its color. She is not a bystander, but the original purchaser. The crate's contents have been altered, she has discovered the fraud, and the tradesman now attempts to deny responsibility." I watched as the constable finally gestured for both parties to accompany him, the woman following anxiously behind. "Remarkable," I said, "and all from a glance." Holmes turned to me, his expression suddenly serious. "It is no different from our present case, Watson. Mr. Markham has seen something that appears inexplicable, but I assure you, it is no more supernatural than that crate of tea. And yet," I said, "his description is—" Holmes rose and set aside his violin. "Unsettling, yes, but not beyond reason." He crossed to the mantel and took up his pipe. "Let us consider the facts. A shadow moving independently of its source, a delay in motion, a gesture deliberate, purposeful. It suggests intelligence," I said. Holmes nodded. "Indeed, and where there is intelligence there is intent. You believe he is being followed by a person?" "I believe," said Holmes carefully, "that Mr. Markham is the subject of a calculated observation. The question is not whether he is followed, but why." At that moment there came a knock at the door, followed by the entrance of a boy from the Baker Street irregulars, a wiry lad with sharp eyes, and a cap pulled low over his brow. "Message for you, Mr. Holmes," said he, handing over a folded paper. Holmes opened it and scanned its contents briefly. "Ah," he said, "our day begins." "What is it?" I asked. "A small matter," Holmes replied, though I detected a note of interest in his tone. "A gentleman in Bloomsbury reports the disappearance of a valuable document under curious circumstances." "And you intend to investigate?" Holmes shrugged lightly. "It may prove instructive. Come, Watson, there is time before our engagement with Mr. Markham this evening." Though I suspected that Holmes's interest in the matter was not entirely incidental, I accompanied him without protest. Our destination proved to be a modest but well-appointed residence in Bloomsbury, where we were received by a Mr. Jonathan Pritchard, a nervous, bespectacled man whose agitation rivaled that of our previous client. The document, he explained, was secured within my study. No sign of forced entry, no disturbance save that it is gone. Holmes listened with polite attention, his eyes wandering about the room. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the study. "Of course." We entered a narrow chamber lined with bookshelves. A writing desk stood near the window, its surface meticulously arranged. Holmes moved slowly, examining each object with care. "You live alone, Mr. Pritchard?" he asked. "No servants. A charwoman who attends in the mornings." Holmes nodded. "And you are certain the document was here last night?" "Absolutely." Holmes bent toward the desk, his fingers hovering just above its surface. "Curious," he murmured. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes straightened. "There is no dust." Mr. Pritchard blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The desk," Holmes said. "Every other surface in this room bears a fine layer of dust save this one. Is that significant?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Immensely. It suggests that the desk has been wiped recently and deliberately." "But why would the thief—" "Precisely the question," Holmes replied. He turned toward the window. "Locked from within?" Holmes examined the latch, then the frame. "No tampering," he said. "And yet the document is gone." I frowned. "Then how—" Holmes raised a hand. "Observe, Watson." He pointed toward the floor, where faint impressions marked the carpet. "Footprints," I said. "Not quite," Holmes corrected. "The absence of footprints. The carpet fibers here are undisturbed except along this narrow path." He traced a line from the door to the desk. The intruder walked with extraordinary care, placing each step precisely to avoid detection. Mr. Pritchard stared in amazement. "You mean someone was here?" Holmes turned to him. "My dear sir, someone was here, and they wished very much not to be noticed." He paused, then added quietly, "Just as in Mr. Markham's case." I felt a sudden chill. "You believe the two are connected?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead he moved to the bookshelf and examined its contents. "Tell me, Mr. Pritchard," he said, "what was the nature of the missing document?" "A financial record," Pritchard replied. "Nothing of great value, at least, not to anyone but myself." Holmes's eyes flickered. "Indeed." He replaced a book and stepped back. "I regret to say that I can offer you no immediate solution," he said. However, I advise you to exercise caution in the coming days." Mr. Pritchard looked disappointed, but thanked us nonetheless. As we departed, I turned to Holmes. "You suspect a connection," I said. Holmes lit his pipe, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. "I do more than suspect it," he replied. "I am nearly certain of it. But how can a stolen document relate to a shadow in an alley?" Holmes smiled. "In both cases we have an observer who wishes to remain unseen. In both we find evidence of meticulous planning and an almost theatrical flair." "You mean the shadow?" Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "Consider, Watson, what better way to terrify a man than to convince him he is being followed by something beyond comprehension?" "You think it is a ruse?" "I think," said Holmes, "that it is a performance, and like all performances it serves a purpose, and that purpose—" Holmes glanced at me, his eyes gleaming. "To drive Mr. Markham into a state of fear and thereby control his actions. I considered this. But to what end?" Holmes tapped his pipe thoughtfully. "That, my dear Watson, is the question. That evening, as the fog once more descended upon London, we prepared to accompany Mr. Markham to the alley where his strange encounters had occurred. Holmes was in high spirits, though I could not share his enthusiasm. The memory of Markham's account lingered uneasily in my mind. "You are uneasy," Holmes observed. "Would you not be?" I replied. Holmes smiled. "On the contrary, I find the prospect most stimulating." He donned his coat and took up his walking-stick. "Come, Watson, let us meet our shadow." As we stepped out into the fog-laden streets, I could not shake the feeling that we were walking not merely toward a mystery, but toward something far more deliberate and dangerous than either of us had yet imagined. The alley of silent footsteps. It was nearing the 9th hour when Holmes and I arrived at the appointed meeting-place, a narrow corner where the dim glow of a flickering gas lamp scarcely penetrated the heavy London fog. The air was damp and chill, clinging to one's lungs with a most oppressive weight, and every distant sound seemed curiously distorted, as though the city itself were holding its breath. Mr. Edward Markham stood waiting for us, his figure emerging gradually from the mist like a spectre reluctant to be seen. He started visibly upon recognizing Holmes and hastened forward. "You have come," he said with evident relief. "As promised," Holmes replied calmly. "You have followed my instructions?" "I have avoided the alley entirely since last night," said Markham, "though I confess I have scarcely slept." "That is unfortunate," Holmes said. "A fatigued mind is prone to exaggeration. Still, tonight we shall rely not upon imagination but upon observation." Holmes turned his gaze toward the narrow passageway that lay some 20 yards ahead, dark slit between two tall, soot-stained buildings, scarcely illuminated by a solitary gas lamp at its far end. "There," said Markham, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That is the place." Holmes said nothing, but I saw his eyes sharpen with that keen intensity which always signaled the full engagement of his faculties. "Come, Watson," he said at last. "Let us proceed." I confess that I felt a distinct reluctance as we approached the alley. There was something in its aspect, perhaps the unnatural stillness, or the way the fog seemed to gather more thickly within its confines, that stirred a vague unease within me. Holmes, however, advanced without hesitation. "Remain composed, Mr. Markham," he said, "and do exactly as you have done before. Walk at a natural pace. We shall follow." Markham nodded, though I could see his hands trembling slightly. He stepped into the alley, his figure quickly swallowed by the gloom. Holmes placed a hand upon my arm. "Not too close," he murmured. "We must not disturb the conditions of the experiment." We waited a moment before entering ourselves. The alley was narrower than I had expected, its walls rising steeply on either side, their surfaces slick with damp. The gas lamp at the far end cast a feeble yellow light that struggled to define the shapes within its reach. Markham walked ahead of us, his footsteps echoing faintly against the stone. "Observe carefully, Watson," Holmes whispered, "particularly the play of light and shadow." I fixed my gaze upon Markham's figure, noting the way his shadow stretched before him, elongated by the lamp. For several moments nothing occurred. Then, quite suddenly, I felt it, a sensation not of sound, nor of movement, but of presence. I glanced toward Holmes, but his eyes were fixed intently upon the wall to our right. "Do you see it?" he murmured. At first I saw nothing. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I perceived a darker shape within the general gloom, a shadow that seemed to cling unnaturally to the wall, distinct from the others. It moved. I started involuntarily. The shadow glided along the brickwork, keeping pace with Markham, yet it did not correspond precisely with his movements. There was, as he had described, a faint but unmistakable delay. "Good heavens!" I whispered. Holmes's grip tightened slightly on my arm. "Steady, Watson." Markham had not yet noticed. He continued forward, though I saw his shoulders tense, as though he sensed something amiss. The shadow lengthened as he approached the lamp, its form becoming more defined, yet no figure stood between him and the light to cast it. Then, as if in dreadful imitation, Markham raised his hand to his face. A fraction of a second later the shadow did the same. Markham froze. "So," said Holmes softly, "the performance begins." Markham turned slowly, his eyes wide with terror. "Do you see it?" he cried. "We see it," Holmes replied calmly. "Continue moving." "I cannot," Markham exclaimed. "It is. Move," Holmes said sharply. Something in his tone compelled obedience. Markham resumed his steps, though his movements were now hurried and uneven. The shadow followed. Holmes released my arm and stepped forward. "Now, Watson," he said quietly. Before I could inquire further, he produced from his pocket a small object no larger than a coin, which he flicked deftly toward the wall. There came a faint metallic click, followed by a sudden shift in the shadow's form. For an instant it wavered distorted, as though its source had been disrupted. Holmes's eyes flashed. "What is it?" I asked. "Light," he said. "Artificial and manipulated." He strode forward with renewed purpose. "Mr. Markham, stop where you are." Markham halted, his back pressed against the wall. The shadow lingered beside him, still and ominous. Holmes moved closer, his gaze sweeping the alley with rapid precision. "Watson, the lamp," he said. I looked toward the gas lamp at the far end. "What of it?" "Examine its base." I hurried forward, my heart pounding. The lamp stood upon a narrow iron post, its glass enclosure fogged with condensation. At its base I noticed something unusual, a thin wire, scarcely visible against the dark metal, running along the ground and disappearing into a crack in the wall. "Holmes!" I called. "There is a wire here." "Precisely," he replied. He joined me at the lamp and crouched down, examining the wire with evident satisfaction. "A clever arrangement," he said. "Very clever indeed. But what does it mean?" I asked. Holmes followed the wire with his eyes as it vanished into the wall. "It means," he said, "that the shadow is not cast by a man but by a device." "A device?" "A projection, Watson, likely controlled from a concealed position nearby." I felt a mixture of relief and astonishment. "Then there is nothing supernatural about it." Holmes smiled faintly. "Did you ever truly believe there was?" Before I could answer, Markham cried out, "Holmes, it is moving again!" We turned. The shadow had begun to advance slowly, deliberately toward Markham. Holmes's expression hardened. "Whoever controls this," he said, "has realized that we are not alone." He rose swiftly. "Watson, stay with Mr. Markham." "And you?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "I intend to meet our shadow at its source." Without another word he darted toward the wall where the wire disappeared, his movements swift and silent. I remained beside Markham, who clutched my arm with a grip born of sheer terror. "What is happening?" he whispered. "Holmes has discovered the mechanism," I said, though I could not entirely suppress my own unease. The shadow continued its slow approach, its form stretching unnaturally across the bricks. Then, suddenly, it vanished. The wall was empty. A moment later we heard a muffled sound of scuffle, followed by a sharp exclamation from Holmes. I rushed toward the source, Markham close behind. Holmes stood near a narrow doorway, half concealed within the wall itself, a door so cleverly disguised that I had not noticed it before. The door now stood ajar. Holmes looked at me, his expression a curious blend of satisfaction and frustration. "He was here," he said. "Who?" I asked. "Our operator," Holmes replied. "But he has fled. Did you see him?" "Only a glimpse," said Holmes. "A man of mutawassit serial haraka. Well prepared and evidently watching us as closely as we watched him." Markham leaned against the wall, visibly shaken. "Then it is real," he said. "Someone is doing this to me." "Yes," said Holmes. "That much is now beyond doubt." He stepped into the concealed doorway, beckoning us to follow. Inside we found a narrow chamber, little more than a hidden recess within the wall. Upon a small table lay a curious apparatus, a lantern fitted with adjustable shutters, lenses, and a series of thin metal plates. Holmes examined it with keen interest. "A projection device," he said. "Ingenious in its simplicity. And this creates the shadow?" I asked. "Indeed," Holmes replied. "By manipulating light and obstruction, one may produce the illusion of a moving form, particularly in conditions such as these." Markham stared at the device. "But why?" he asked. "Why go to such lengths?" Holmes straightened, his expression thoughtful. "That," he said, "is the question that remains." He paused, then added quietly, But I suspect, Mr. Markham, that you are not merely the victim of a prank or even of intimidation." Markham looked at him anxiously. "What do you mean?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "I mean," he said, "that someone wishes you to believe you are being watched because they are waiting for something." "For what?" Holmes turned toward the darkened alley beyond. "For you to make a mistake." A silence followed, heavy with implication. At length Holmes extinguished the lantern and stepped back into the fog. "Come," he said, "we have seen enough for tonight." As we emerged once more into the dim light of the street, I could not help but feel that the mystery, though stripped of its supernatural guise, had grown only more troubling in its reality. For if a man would go to such elaborate lengths merely to cast a shadow, then what darker purpose lay behind it? And who, in the vast and restless city of London, watched us now from within the fog? The obvious culprit. The events of that night left a deep impression upon my mind, though not, I confess, of the sort that brought comfort. That the shadow in the alley had been revealed as an artificial contrivance should, by all rational measure, have dispelled the dread which Mr. Markham had so vividly described. Yet, paradoxically, it served only to deepen the mystery. For while a phantom may be dismissed as illusion, a man who creates such an illusion must possess both purpose and design, and it was this unseen intelligence, lurking behind mechanical ingenuity, that troubled me far more than any ghostly apparition. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated by the discovery. "You perceive, Watson," said he, as we returned to Baker Street through the thinning fog, "how swiftly the supernatural dissolves beneath the lens of reason. What appeared as an impossibility is reduced to a matter of optics and positioning." "And yet," I replied, "the intention behind it remains obscure." Holmes gave a slight nod. "For the moment. But we have gained something of far greater value. And that is a direction." The following morning dawned cold and grey, the city still shrouded in a lingering haze. I found Holmes already engaged at the breakfast table, though his attention was less upon the meal before him than upon a series of notes spread across the cloth. "You slept poorly," I observed. "On the contrary," said he, "I slept most efficiently. My mind, however, did not." He gestured toward the papers. "I have been considering Mr. Markham's circumstances." "Tell me, Watson, what do we know of him?" "Very little," I admitted. "He is a man of business, apparently respectable, with no known enemies." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "My dear Watson, there is no such thing as a man without enemies, only men who are unaware of them." He rose and crossed to the mantel. "Let us begin with the obvious question. Why Mr. Markham?" "Because he uses the alley," I suggested. Holmes smiled faintly. "A circumstance, not a cause. No, this was deliberate. The device was installed with care, the timing precise, the effect calculated to produce maximum psychological disturbance." He paused. "Such effort is rarely expended without significant motive." Before I could reply, there came a brisk knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered shortly thereafter, announcing the arrival of Inspector Lestrade. The inspector's presence was as brisk and self-assured as ever. He entered with an air of quiet triumph, removing his gloves as though already confident of his position. "Mr. Holmes," said he, with a slight inclination of the head. "Dr. Watson." "Inspector," Holmes replied. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" Lestrade smiled thinly. "I believe I have come upon your little shadow case." Holmes's expression remained neutral, though I detected a flicker of interest. "Indeed? Pray enlighten us." Lestrade produced a small notebook. "A man was arrested late last night not far from the alley in question. A known petty criminal name of Thomas Keegan. He was found in possession of certain mechanical devices, lenses, wires, and the like." I glanced at Holmes. "That sounds promising," I said. "Quite," Lestrade continued. Under questioning, he admitted to constructing a projection apparatus. Claims he was paid to frighten a gentleman who passed through the alley regularly. Holmes steepled his fingers. "And did he name this gentleman?" Lestrade nodded. "Edward Markham." A silence followed. "Well," said Lestrade, with a hint of satisfaction, "a straightforward case, I should think. A hired ruffian, a bit of theatrical trickery, and a frightened victim. The fellow claims he was paid by an unknown party, though Festair say that is merely his way of avoiding a more serious charge." Holmes rose slowly. "And this Keegan, where is he now?" "In custody," said Lestrade. "You are welcome to question him, though I fancy you will find little more than I have already uncovered." Holmes reached for his coat. "On the contrary, Inspector, I should very much like to meet this man." We arrived at the police station within the hour, where Lestrade led us to a small, dimly lit room. Seated within was a man of rough appearance, his clothes worn and his expression sullen. "This is Keegan," said Lestrade. Holmes regarded him quietly for a moment before speaking. "You constructed the device in the alley?" he asked. Keegan shrugged. "For what purpose?" "Told you already," said the man. "To scare a gent. Easy money." Holmes stepped closer. "And who employed you?" Keegan shifted uneasily. "Don't know his name." "Describe him." "Tall. Well-dressed. Spoke proper-like. Paid in advance." Holmes nodded. "And you never questioned his motives?" Keegan gave a short laugh. "Not my business to ask questions." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "No, but it is mine." He turned suddenly to Lestrade. "Inspector, did this man resist arrest?" "A bit," Lestrade admitted. "Nothing unusual." Holmes's eyes flicked back to Keegan's hands. "Curious," he murmured. "What is?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he addressed Keegan once more. "You are left-handed," he said. Keegan looked up, startled. "So what?" "And yet," Holmes continued, "the device in the alley was constructed for right-handed operation." Keegan frowned. "I just did what I was told." Holmes smiled faintly. "Did you indeed?" He stepped back. "Inspector, may I see the devices recovered from this man?" Lestrade produced a small bundle of items, lenses, wires, and a compact lantern apparatus. Holmes examined them carefully. After a moment he shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "No?" Lestrade repeated. "This is not the device we saw last night." Lestrade stiffened. "What do you mean?" "It matches the description exactly." Holmes set the apparatus down. "It matches a description, certainly, but not the device." He turned to me. "Watson, you will recall the precision of the mechanism in the alley, the adjustable shutters, the calibrated delay in movement." This he gestured toward the item seized, crude by comparison. Functional, perhaps, but lacking the sophistication we observed. Lestrade frowned. "You are suggesting there are two such devices?" "I am suggesting," said Holmes, "that this man is not the architect of our shadow." Keegan shifted in his seat. "I told you I just did what I was paid for." Holmes regarded him steadily. "And yet you cannot replicate the device we discovered, nor can you explain its operation in any detail." Keegan said nothing. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, your man may well be involved, but he is not the mind behind this affair." Lestrade's expression hardened. "You are overcomplicating matters, Holmes. We have a suspect, a confession, and physical evidence. What more do you require?" Holmes smiled thinly. "The truth, Inspector. Nothing more and nothing less." As we left the station, I could not help but feel a growing sense of unease. "Lestrade seems convinced," I said. "Lestrade is often convinced," Holmes replied dryly. "It is one of his more persistent habits. But if Keegan is not responsible, then who is?" Holmes lit his pipe, his gaze distant. "A man of means," he said. "A man with knowledge of optics, mechanics, and most importantly human psychology." "And Mr. Markham?" I asked. "What role does he play in this?" Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "That, my dear Watson, is the most curious question of all." He paused, then added quietly, "For I begin to suspect that our client has not told us everything." I stared at him. "You believe he is hiding something?" Holmes nodded. "Not out of malice, perhaps, but out of fear. And fear, Watson, is a most unreliable narrator." He turned toward Baker Street, his pace quickening. "We must speak with Mr. Markham again. And if he refuses?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Then we shall give him a reason not to." Thus, what had seemed at first a simple unraveling of deception now revealed itself to be something far more intricate. The obvious culprit had been presented and dismissed. The shadow, once a mystery of the unknown, had become instead a deliberate instrument of design. And somewhere, beyond the reach of our immediate understanding, there remained a mind calculating, patient, and unseen, guiding the events of this strange affair with a precision that both intrigued and unsettled me. Little did I know that the next development would not only deepen the mystery but cast doubt upon everything we believed we had thus far uncovered. The detail that should not exist. It is a peculiarity of my friend Sherlock Holmes that, having dismissed an explanation which would satisfy any ordinary investigator, he appears neither frustrated nor uncertain, but rather invigorated, as though each discarded theory clears the path towards something far more elegant and inevitable. So it was on the morning following our interview with the unfortunate Keegan. Holmes spoke little as we returned to Baker Street, nor did he immediately seek out Mr. Markham as he had suggested. Instead, he shut himself within his room for the better part of 2 hours, during which I could hear the occasional shifting of furniture, the opening and closing of drawers, and once, distinctly, the sharp click of a lens being adjusted. When at last he emerged, his manner had changed. There was in his eyes that peculiar brightness which I had come to associate with the discovery of some hidden thread within a tangled skein. "Watson," said he, taking up his hat, "we are not yet ready to confront Mr. Markham." "Then where are we bound?" I asked. "To the alley," he replied. "But we were there only last night." Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes, and yet we did not see it. The daylight lent the place a wholly different aspect. The oppressive gloom of the previous evening had lifted, revealing the narrow passage in all its unremarkable simplicity. The walls, though stained and weathered, bore no hint of menace, and the gas lamps stood quietly inert beneath the pale sky. "Extraordinary," I remarked. "It seems almost absurd that such a place could produce so unsettling an effect." Holmes did not reply. He moved slowly along the length of the alley, his eyes scanning every inch of its surface. "Observe, Watson," he said at last, gesturing toward the wall where the shadow had appeared. "What do you notice?" I stepped closer, examining the bricks. "Nothing of particular interest," I admitted. "The surface is uneven, as one would expect. Some discoloration—" Holmes nodded. "Just so. And yet look here." He indicated a small section of the wall at about shoulder height. I leaned in. At first I saw nothing unusual. Then, as the light shifted, I detected a faint mark, scarcely visible against the darkened brick. "A smudge," I suggested. Holmes's lips curved slightly. "Not a smudge. A residue." He produced a small lens and held it to the mark. "Grease," he said. "Applied with precision and recently. But what does it signify?" Holmes straightened. "It signifies contact," he said. "Repeated contact at a consistent height." I frowned. "From the operator?" "Possibly. But consider this: why would an operator, concealed within a hidden chamber, need to touch the wall at all?" I had no answer. Holmes stepped back, his gaze sweeping the alley once more. "Now," he said, "let us consider the position of the shadow." He paced slowly, measuring distances with his eye. "Last night the shadow appeared here approximately 6 feet from the ground, elongated toward the lamp. Its movement corresponded with Mr. Markham's, though with a delay." "Yes," I said. "You believe it was controlled from the hidden chamber?" Holmes shook his head. "That is what we assumed. But assumptions, Watson, are the enemy of precision." He crouched near the base of the wall and traced the line where the wire had run. "The wire leads to the chamber, certainly. But the shadow itself, its behavior, was too refined for this apparatus alone." "You mean the device was insufficient?" "Precisely. It could produce a shadow, but not that shadow." I felt a stir of unease. "Then what are you suggesting?" Holmes rose slowly. "I am suggesting," he said, "that what we witnessed was not merely a projection, but a combination of projection and something else." "Something else?" Holmes turned to me, his eyes intent. "Something physical." At that moment a sound echoed faintly from the far end of the alley, the distant tread of footsteps. Holmes's head turned sharply. "Someone approaches," he said. A figure emerged from the street beyond, a man of Arabic meme, Arabicta, Arabiquab, Arabic scene, Arabictat height, dressed in a dark overcoat and carrying a small leather case. He walked with measured steps, his gaze fixed ahead. As he drew nearer, I saw that his face bore a certain resemblance to Mr. Markham, not in feature, but in expression. There was the same tension, the same air of preoccupation. The man halted upon seeing us. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I was not aware this passage was occupied." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "No inconvenience, I assure you." The man nodded and made to pass, but Holmes spoke again. "You are acquainted with Mr. Edward Markham, I believe?" The man stopped. "I am," he said cautiously. "May I ask why?" Holmes stepped forward. "Because, sir," said he, "you bear a striking resemblance to him, not in appearance, but in habit. Your posture, your manner of movement, they are remarkably similar." The man's expression tightened. I failed to see the relevance. Holmes smiled faintly. "Perhaps none at all. And yet, one cannot help but notice such coincidences." The man hesitated, then said, "My name is Charles Markham. Edward is my brother." I glanced at Holmes, who showed no outward surprise. "Indeed," said he. "Then you will forgive my curiosity." Charles Markham's gaze shifted briefly toward the wall, then back to Holmes. "Is there some difficulty?" he asked. Holmes's eyes followed that fleeting glance, and I saw in that instant the spark of realization. "No difficulty," said Holmes smoothly. "Merely an interest in the peculiarities of this alley." Charles gave a curt nod. "I see." He moved past us, his pace quickening as he exited into the street. Holmes watched him go, his expression thoughtful. "Well, Holmes turned to me slowly. "Watson," said he, "we have just encountered the first truly significant detail in this case." "The brother?" "Not merely the brother," Holmes replied, "but his reaction." "You mean his glance?" Holmes nodded. He looked at the walnut at us, and he did so instinctively as though expecting to find something there. "I consider this. You believe he knows about the device?" Holmes's smile was faint but unmistakable. "My dear Watson, I believe he knows far more than that." We returned to Baker Street in thoughtful silence. Holmes, as was his habit, said little, though I could see that his mind was actively engaged. At length he spoke. "Let us review what we have learned. The shadow is artificial yet more complex than a simple projection. The device in the alley is insufficient to produce the observed effect. A secondary mechanism or agent is involved." "And Charles Markham?" I asked. Holmes tapped his fingers lightly against the arm of his chair. "He is connected. Of that I am now certain." "But in what way?" Holmes's gaze grew distant. "That remains to be determined. But consider this: 2 brothers, one of whom is subjected to a campaign of psychological terror. A hired criminal provides a crude imitation of the effect, yet the true mechanism lies elsewhere. And now we discover that the brother himself has knowledge of the scene." He paused. "Does it not strike you as suggestive?" "Of what?" I asked. Holmes looked at me, his eyes gleaming. "Of motive, Watson. That evening, as the light faded once more, and the shadows of London lengthened across its streets, Holmes made a most unexpected announcement. 'We shall not return to the alley tonight,' said he." "Not return?" I exclaimed. "But surely—" "On the contrary," Holmes interrupted, "we have seen all that the alley can presently reveal." "Then what do you propose?" Holmes rose and took up his coat. "We shall visit Mr. Markham." "At this hour?" "Precisely at this hour," said Holmes, "for it is at such times that men are least prepossessed, most revealing." He turned toward the door, his expression set. "Come, Watson, it is time we discovered what our client has neglected to tell us." Thus it was that we set out once more into the London night, not toward the place where the shadow had appeared, but toward the man who had first brought it to our attention. And though I could not yet discern the full shape of Holmes's reasoning, I felt with growing certainty that the case had taken a decisive turn. For the shadow, it seemed, was no longer the mystery. The mystery was the man who feared Etan, the brother who did not. The second disturbance. It was close upon 10 o'clock when we arrived at the residence of Mr. Edward Markham, situated in a quiet but respectable street not far from Bloomsbury. The fog had begun to gather once more, though less densely than on the previous evening, and the gas lamps cast long, wavering beams across the damp pavement. Holmes rang the bell without hesitation. "You expect him to receive us at this hour?" I asked. "My dear Watson," said he, "a man who believes himself pursued by an unseen force seldom sleeps easily. I should be greatly surprised if Mr. Markham were not awake and waiting." The door was opened by a servant, whose startled expression betrayed the unusual nature of our visit. Upon hearing Holmes's name, however, she ushered us in with evident relief. "Mr. Markham is in his study, sir," she said, "though I fear he has been greatly agitated all evening." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "That is precisely what we anticipated." We were shown into a modest but well-appointed room at the rear of the house. A fire burned low in the grate, and the air was heavy with the scent of tobacco. Edward Markham stood by the window, his back to us. At the sound of our entrance he turned sharply, his face pale and drawn. "Mr. Holmes," he exclaimed, "you have come, thank heaven!" Holmes inclined his head. "You appear distressed, Mr. Markham." "Distressed?" he repeated with a hollow laugh. "I am undone, sir, utterly undone." Holmes stepped forward, his manner calm but attentive. "Pray compose yourself. Tell us what has occurred." Markham ran a hand through his hair, his agitation scarcely contained. "It has happened again," he said. "Not in the alley, but here. In my own house." I felt a sudden tightening in my chest. "Here?" I said. "You are certain?" "I saw it with my own eyes," Markham cried. "In this very room." Holmes's gaze swept the chamber, noting every detail. "Describe precisely what you observed." Markham took a trembling breath. "I was seated at my desk," he said, gesturing toward a writing-table near the fire, "attempting to distract myself with correspondence. The lamp was lit there, you see, and the curtains were drawn." Holmes nodded. "I became aware of a movement upon the wall," Markham continued. "At first I thought it a trick of the light, but then I saw it clearly." His voice dropped. "The shadow." "The same shadow." Holmes's expression did not change. "In what position?" "Behind me," said Markham, "cast upon the wall above the fireplace." Holmes stepped closer to the mantel, examining the surface, and there was no one present.
"No one,"
Markham replied. The door was closed, the windows secured. Yet the shadow, it moved.
"How?"
It advanced slowly, as before. And then he hesitated. "And then?" Holmes prompted. "It reached toward me," Markham whispered, "as though to seize me." A silence fell upon the room. "And what did you do?" I asked. "I turned," said Markham, "but there was nothing at all. When I looked back, the shadow was gone." Holmes moved to the window and examined the latch. "Locked," he murmured. He turned to the door. No signs of entry. He paused, then said quietly, "Most interesting." "Interesting?" Markham repeated. "Sir, I am being driven to madness." Holmes faced him, his expression steady. "No, Mr. Markham," said he. "You are being studied." Markham stared at him. "What do you mean?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward the desk and examined its surface. "May I?" he asked. Markham nodded. Holmes leaned over the desk, his eyes narrowing. "Watson," he said softly, "observe this." I joined him. "What is it?" Holmes pointed to a small area near the edge of the desk. "There," he said. I saw it at once a faint mark, similar to the one we had observed in the alley. "Grease," I said. "Precisely," Holmes replied. "At the same height and of the same consistency." Markham looked bewildered. "I do not understand." Holmes straightened. "Nor do I yet," said he. "But we are drawing closer." He turned to Markham. "You say the shadow appeared upon this wall. Tell me, was the movement identical to that in the alley?" Markham hesitated. "No," he said slowly. "It was more distinct." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And there is something else," Markham added, his voice unsteady. "What is that?" Holmes asked. Markham swallowed. "It left something behind." Holmes stiffened slightly. "Where?" Markham pointed toward the mantel. Holmes moved swiftly to the indicated spot. Resting upon the mantelpiece was a small object no larger than a coin. He picked it up carefully. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes held it to the light. "A token," he said. "Or perhaps—" I leaned closer. It was a thin disk of metal, etched with a curious design and abstract shape that seemed almost like a distorted human figure. "What does it mean?" Markham asked. Holmes did not reply at once. He turned the disk over in his fingers, his expression thoughtful. "At present," he said, "it means that whoever is behind this affair has chosen to escalate matters." "Escalate?" I repeated. Holmes nodded. In the alley the effect was distant observational. Here it is personal. He looked at Markham. "You are no longer merely being followed, Mr. Markham. You are being targeted." Markham sank into a chair, his face ashen. "But why?" he whispered. "What have I done to deserve this?" Holmes regarded him steadily. "That is precisely what we must determine." At that moment there came a sudden commotion from the hollow raised voice, followed by hurried footsteps. The door burst open, and the servant reappeared, visibly shaken. "Sir!" she cried. There has been a disturbance." "What kind of disturbance?" Markham demanded. "In the study upstairs," she said. "Something has been overturned and the window is open." Holmes was already moving. "Come, Watson." We followed him swiftly up the stairs, Markham close behind. The study above was in disarray. Papers lay scattered across the floor, a chair overturned, and the window stood open, the curtains fluttering in the night air. Holmes crossed to the window and looked out. "Recently opened," he said. "The latch is still warm. Can you see anyone?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "The fog conceals all." He turned back to the room. Quickly, Watson examined the floor. I bent down, scanning the carpet. "There are marks," I said. "Footprints faint but present." Holmes joined me. "Boots," he said. "Light tread." The intruder moved with care, but not with the precision we observed in the alley. "Another person?" "Perhaps," Holmes replied. He rose and surveyed the room. "Mr. Markham," he said, "was anything taken?" Markham looked about in confusion. I do not know." Holmes moved to a cabinet and opened it. "Here," he said. "What was kept there?" I asked. Markham hesitated. "Papers," he said. "Business documents." Holmes turned to him sharply. "What kind of documents?" "Financial records," Markham replied. "Nothing of great importance." Holmes's gaze hardened. "On the contrary, I believe they are of the utmost importance." He closed the cabinet. "The pattern becomes clearer." "How so?" I asked. Holmes turned to me. "First a shadow to instill fear, then a token to assert presence, and now a theft." He paused. "This is no longer a matter of intimidation alone. It is a calculated progression." Markham gripped the back of a chair. "You mean they are after my papers?" Holmes nodded. and they are willing to employ both psychological and physical means to obtain them. But why not simply steal them outright? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. Because, Watson, it is far more effective to make a man surrender something willingly than to take it by force. He looked once more at the open window, and I suspect that this is only the beginning. As we departed the house later that night, the fog seemed thicker than before, pressing in upon us from all sides. You believe the same person is responsible for all of this? I asked. Holmes considered for a moment. No, he said at last. I believe there are at least 2 individuals involved, perhaps more. And Charles Markham? Holmes's eyes narrowed. He remains at the center of my suspicions, but we saw him earlier today. He appeared unaware. Holmes gave a soft laugh. My dear Watson, appearances are the very tools by which such men operate. He paused, then added quietly, and I begin to suspect that the truth, when revealed, will prove far more intricate and far more troubling than we have yet imagined. I shivered slightly as we walked on, for the case had taken a darker turn. What had begun as a curious illusion in a fog-filled alley had now become something altogether more dangerous, a deliberate campaign, executed with precision and escalating intent. And somewhere, unseen yet ever present, the shadow's true master continued to wish and to wait. That refused to align. If there is one quality in Sherlock Holmes that has ever both fascinated and perplexed me in equal measure, it is his capacity to advance steadily toward the truth while appearing, to all outward observation, to wander further from it. In the days that followed the disturbance at Mr. Markham's residence, my friend seemed to pursue lines of inquiry so disparate and at times so wholly unconnected to the matter at hand, that I confess I began to question whether even his remarkable faculties had not encountered a puzzle too intricate for resolution. Yet experience had taught me patience. Holmes, I knew, never wandered without purpose. The morning after the attempted intrusion found Holmes already abroad before I had risen. Upon his return, shortly after 11, his coat bore the damp stains of travel, and his expression was one of deep and thoughtful concentration. "You have been busy," I remarked. "Moderately so," he replied, removing his gloves. "I have called upon 3 separate establishments, each of which has contributed something, though not yet enough. And these establishments were a metal engraver in Clerkenwell, a supplier of optical instruments near the Strand, and a pawnbroker of questionable reputation in Whitechapel." I stared at him. "And all this relates to the case?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Indirectly. The token left in Mr. Markham's study is not, as one might suppose, a mere trinket. It is manufactured deliberately and with care." He reached into his pocket and produced the small metal disc we had recovered. "I have seen its like before," he continued, "though not often. You recognize it?" "I recognize the workmanship," said Holmes. "It is not common. Such precision suggests either a specialist craftsman or a client with very particular requirements." "And did the engraver identify it?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "Not directly, but he confirmed that the technique used to etch this design is rarely employed outside certain—" "What kind of commissions?" Holmes replaced the disc in his pocket. "Those that are not meant to attract attention." I felt a growing unease. "And the optical supplier?" "Ah," said Holmes, "there we find something more tangible. A purchase was made some weeks ago, lenses, shutters, and a modified lantern assembly. The description matches in part the device we discovered in the alley." "Do they know who made the purchase?" "A gentleman of refined appearance," Holmes replied. "Well spoken. Paid in cash." "Charles Markham?" I suggested. Holmes's lips curved slightly. "A possibility, but not yet a certainty." "And the pawnbroker?" Holmes's expression darkened slightly. "A dead end for the moment. But even dead ends, Watson, may serve to define the boundaries of our inquiry. That afternoon we received an unexpected visit from Inspector Lestrade. His manner, though still confident, bore a trace of irritation. "You are right," he said without preamble. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "A rare and gratifying admission, Inspector. Pray continue." Lestrade frowned. "Keegan has retracted part of his statement. Claims now that he was given only partial instructions and that the device he constructed was not the only one involved." Holmes nodded. "As I suspected." Lestrade crossed his arms. "But here is the difficulty. He insists that he never entered the alley himself after installing his apparatus. Says he was instructed to leave it in place and await further payment." "Which never came?" Holmes asked. "Precisely." Holmes leaned back in his chair. "Then he was merely a pawn." "That is your conclusion?" Lestrade said. "It is the only one that fits the facts," Holmes replied. Lestrade paced the room. And what of the intrusion at Markham's house? We have no sign of forced entry beyond the open window, and nothing to identify the intruder." Holmes tapped his fingers lightly. "On the contrary, Inspector, we have a great deal to identify him by." Lestrade stopped. "You do?" Holmes smiled faintly. "We have his method." Later that evening Holmes proposed that we pay a second visit to Mr. Markham, not to question him directly, but to observe. "You believe he is still withholding information?" I asked. "I am certain of it," Holmes replied. "But I no longer believe it is merely a matter of omission." "What do you mean?" Holmes paused before answering. "I mean, Watson, that Mr. Markham's fear is genuine but not entirely honest." We arrived at the Markham residence shortly after dusk. This time Holmes did not announce our presence. Instead, he led me quietly along the side of the house, where a narrow passage afforded a view of the rear windows. "You intend to watch him?" I whispered. "For a time," Holmes replied. "Observation, Watson, is often more revealing than interrogation." We took up a position partially concealed by the shadows of an adjoining structure. From our vantage point we could see into the study below, where Markham sat alone at his desk. A lamp cast a steady glow across the room, and his figure appeared tense, his movements restless. "He seems deeply unsettled," I murmured. Holmes said nothing. We watched in silence for several minutes. A movement, not within the room but beyond it. Holmes's hand tightened on my arm. "Look," he whispered. At the far edge of the window, just beyond the reach of the lamplight, a figure passed, swift, silent, and barely visible. I caught only a glimpse, a dark shape, moving with purpose. "Did you see?" "Yes," Holmes said quietly. He straightened at once. We moved quickly around the side of the house and toward the rear entrance. Holmes tested the door. It was unlocked. "Curious," he murmured. We entered without sound. Inside, the house was still. Holmes gestured for silence and moved toward the staircase. "Upstairs," he whispered. We ascended cautiously. At the top of the stairs, Holmes paused, listening. There a faint sound, a soft creak as of a floorboard under careful weight. Holmes moved toward it with cat-like precision. The door to the upper study stood slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The room was empty. The window, however, was open once more. Holmes crossed to it and looked out. "Gone," he said. I joined him. "Did he escape the same way as before?" "So it would seem," Holmes replied. He turned back to the room, his gaze sweeping its contents. "Watson," he said, "note this." I followed his gesture. On the desk lay a single sheet of paper. Holmes picked it up. "What is it?" I asked. He held it to the light. "A message." I felt a chill. "Another token?" "No," Holmes said quietly. "Something far more direct." He handed me the paper. Upon it, written in a firm and deliberate hand, were the words, "You have already lost." I looked up. "What does it mean?" Holmes's expression was grave. "It means," said he, "that our adversary is no longer content to remain unseen." At that moment a voice sounded behind us. "You should not have come here." We turned sharply. Standing in the doorway was Charles Markham. His face was pale, but his expression was composed, far more so than that of his brother had ever been. Holmes regarded him steadily. "On the contrary," said he, "I believe it was inevitable." Charles stepped into the room, his gaze shifting briefly to the open window before returning to Holmes. "You are interfering in matters you do not understand," he said. Holmes smiled faintly. "Then I trust you will enlighten us." Charles's eyes hardened. "You have already seen enough." Holmes took a step forward. "Have we? Then perhaps you will explain why your brother is being subjected to such elaborate intimidation." Charles hesitated only for a moment, but it was enough. "I know nothing of that," he said. Holmes's gaze did not waver. "No?" he said softly. "Then you will not object to telling us where you have been this evening?" Charles's expression tightened. "That is none of your concern." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "it is very much my concern." A tense silence followed. Then Charles spoke again, his voice lower. "You would do well to leave this alone, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "My dear sir," said he, "that is the one thing I cannot do." Charles held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned abruptly and left the room. We heard his footsteps recede down the stairs. I exhaled slowly. "What do you make of him?" I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he looked once more at the message in my hand. "Watson," he said at last, "the threads of this case refuse to align, and that, more than anything, confirms that we are dealing with a most unusual intelligence." "You mean Charles?" Holmes shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "Something, or someone beyond him." He turned toward the open window, his gaze fixed upon the darkness beyond. For this is no longer merely a matter of fear or deception." He paused. "It is a contest, and in that moment as I looked upon his face I saw not uncertainty but anticipation. For Sherlock Holmes had recognized in this unseen adversary a mind worthy of his own. And the game, it seemed, had truly begun. The trap is set. There are moments in the course of an investigation when the mind of Sherlock Holmes appears to leap forward with such sudden clarity that all prior confusion is cast aside like mist before the rising sun. Yet in the present case that illumination did not come as a flash, but rather as a slow and deliberate convergence, each thread, once scattered and contradictory, beginning at last to draw toward a single inescapable conclusion. I did not at once perceive this change. Indeed, it was only upon reflection that I recognized the subtle shift in Holmes's manner following our encounter with Charles Markham. He spoke little, as was his custom when deep in thought, yet there was an air of quiet resolution about him which I had learned to interpret as the prelude to decisive action. "You have reached a conclusion," I said to him the following morning as we sat at breakfast. Holmes did not look up from his cup. "I have reached," said he, "a working hypothesis, and you intend to test it?" "Most assuredly." He set down his cup and regarded me with that keen, penetrating gaze which never failed to command my full attention. "Tell me, Watson, what is the one element in this case which refuses to conform?" "The shadow itself," I said. "It is more complex than a simple projection." "Good," Holmes replied. "And what else?" "The presence of multiple agents," I added. "Keegan the intruder, and possibly Charles Markham." Holmes inclined his head. "Now consider this. What if these elements are not separate but coordinated?" "You mean—" "Precisely." I frowned. "But to what end? The theft of documents? The intimidation of Mr. Markham?" Holmes smiled faintly. "You are still thinking in terms of isolated actions, Watson. I ask you to think instead of design." "Design?" I repeated. Holmes rose and began to pace. "Every act in this affair, the shadow in the alley, the token, the intrusion. The message has been executed with a precision that suggests not mere opportunism, but careful orchestration. And you believe Charles Markham is behind it?" Holmes paused. "I believe," said he, "that Charles Markham is involved, but not in the manner one might expect." "You think he is not the mastermind?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "On the contrary, I believe he is something else entirely." Before I could press him further, he turned abruptly. "We must send for Mr. Markham at once." "Edward?" I asked. "And we shall also request the presence of Inspector Lestrade and, if possible, Mr. Charles Markham." "You intend to bring them all together?" Holmes smiled. "My dear Watson, it is time to set the stage." By late afternoon all parties had assembled in the sitting-room at Baker Street. Edward Markham arrived first, his manner anxious but hopeful. Charles followed shortly thereafter, his expression guarded and composed. Inspector Lestrade entered last, his curiosity evident despite his habitual skepticism. Holmes greeted each with polite formality before taking his place by the mantel. "Gentlemen," said he, "I am grateful for your attendance. The matter which brings us together has, I believe, reached a critical point." Edward Markham shifted uneasily. "You have discovered something?" he asked. Holmes inclined his head. "I have discovered enough to warrant a demonstration." Lestrade frowned. "A demonstration?"
"Of what?"
Holmes's smile was slight. "Of the truth, Inspector." He turned to me. "Watson, if you would be so good as to draw the curtains." I complied, plunging the room into a dim, shadowed state, illuminated only by the fire and a single lamp which Holmes adjusted with deliberate care. "Now," said he, "we shall recreate, as closely as possible, the conditions of the original phenomenon." Edward Markham paled. "You mean the shadow?" "Precisely." Holmes moved to a small table upon which he had arranged several objects, a lantern, a series of lenses, and a curious mechanical frame. Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "You have built one of these devices yourself?" Holmes glanced at him. "A crude approximation, Inspector, but sufficient for our purposes." He positioned the lantern and adjusted its shutters. "Mr. Markham," he said, addressing Edward, "I ask that you stand here facing the wall." Edward hesitated, then complied. Holmes turned to Charles. "And you, Sir, pray remain where you are." Charles said nothing, but I noted the slight tightening of his jaw. Holmes extinguished the remaining light, leaving only the controlled beam of the lantern. A shadow appeared upon the wall. It moved. Edward Markham gasped. "The same," he whispered. "It is the same." Holmes did not respond. Instead, he adjusted the mechanism, causing the shadow to shift, elongate, and after a brief Delamere Edwards movements. "Observe," said Holmes. "The illusion is effective but incomplete." He He stepped aside. "Watson, if you please move your hand." I did so. The shadow followed but imperfectly. "Now," Holmes continued, "consider what we observed in the alley and later in Mr. Markham's study." The shadow was more precise, more responsive. Lestrade nodded reluctantly. I admit it was remarkably convincing. Holmes's eyes turned toward Charles. "And that, gentlemen, is because it was not produced by a single mechanism." A silence fell. "What do you mean?" Edward asked. Holmes stepped forward. "I mean that the shadow was the result of two coordinated elements, a projection device and a second agent, positioned to enhance and refine the illusion." Lestrade frowned. "A second man?" Holmes nodded. "A man whose movements could be synchronized with the projection, creating the appearance of an independent, intelligent shadow." Edward stared. "But that would require—" "Close observation," Holmes finished, "and precise timing." He turned to Charles. "And who better to provide such synchronization than one who knows the subject intimately?" Charles's expression hardened. "I do not understand your implication," he said. Holmes smiled faintly. "Then allow me to clarify." He stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. Charles Markham, you have been present at every critical juncture of this case. You possess the means, the knowledge, and most importantly the opportunity to coordinate these events." Edward looked from one to the other, his face stricken. Charles said nothing. Holmes continued. "You are not the architect of the devices, that much is clear. But you are the observer, the one who ensures that the illusion succeeds." Lestrade stepped forward. "Are you accusing this man of conspiracy?" Holmes raised a hand. "I am stating that he plays a role, but not the role you imagine." He turned once more to Charles. "You are not the hunter, Mr. Markham," said he quietly. A long silence followed. Then Charles spoke. "No," he said. His voice was calm, but there was something in it that sent a chill through me. "I am not—" Edward stared at him. "Then what?" Charles looked at his brother. "I am trying to stop him." The words hung in the air like a sudden crack of thunder. Holmes's eyes gleamed, but he did not appear surprised. "Ah," said he softly. "At last." Lestrade blinked. "Stop who?" Charles exhaled slowly. "The man behind all of this," he said. "The one who designed the devices, who hired Keegan, who has been watching Edward from the beginning." Edward's voice trembled. "Who is he?" Charles hesitated. Holmes spoke quietly. "A man of intelligence," he said. "Of patience, and of considerable resources." He paused. "A man who prefers to remain unseen, yet who cannot resist the temptation to announce his presence." He glanced at the message upon the table. "You have already lost." Holmes's gaze hardened. "This is no longer a game of shadows," he said. "It is a challenge." Charles looked at him. "And you intend to accept it?" Holmes's lips curved slightly. "My dear sir," said he, "I accepted it the moment your brother first stepped into Baker Street." Thus the pieces began at last to take their proper shape. The shadow was no longer a mystery but a method. The suspects were no longer isolated but connected. And at the center of it all, unseen yet ever present, there stood a figure whose design had guided every step of the affair. A mind that had anticipated our movements and now awaited our response. As I looked at Holmes that evening, I could not help but feel that we stood upon the edge of something far greater than we had first imagined. For the trap, it seemed, had been set. The only question that remained was this: for whom? The man behind the shadow. It is a curious truth, often borne out in my association with Sherlock Holmes, that the most dangerous adversaries are not those who act in haste or desperation, but those who proceed with patience, who construct their designs layer by layer until the whole appears so intricate that its purpose is obscured even to those caught within it. Such a man, I soon came to understand, stood at the heart of the present affair. The revelation offered by Charles Markham that he was not the architect, but rather an unwilling participant striving to hinder another, had shifted the entire complexion of the case. Yet it had not, as I had hoped, simplified matters. On the contrary, it introduced a new and more formidable unknown. We had unmasked the shadow. Now we sought the mind that cast it. The atmosphere in Baker Street that evening was one of tense anticipation. Edward Markham sat pale and shaken, his earlier fear now compounded by confusion. Charles remained composed, though I detected beneath his calm exterior a strain that suggested long-suppressed anxiety. Inspector Lestrade, for his part, appeared both intrigued and impatient. "Well," said he at last, "if this mysterious gentleman exists, it is time we had a name." Holmes stood by the window, his back to us, gazing out into the fog-shrouded street below. "You shall have one, Inspector," said he quietly. But first we must understand the motive." He turned slowly. "Mr. Edward Markham," he said, "I must ask you a question, and I urge you to answer with complete honesty." Edward swallowed. "I shall try." Holmes's eyes fixed upon him. "In your business dealings, have you ever been in possession of documents, financial or otherwise, which might prove compromising to another party?" Edward hesitated. I deal in investments," he said. "There are always sensitive matters, accounts, partnerships." Holmes raised a hand. "I do not speak of ordinary business, sir. I speak of something more specific, something which another might wish to recover or suppress at any cost." A long pause followed. At last Edward lowered his gaze. There was... Charles closed his eyes briefly, as though in resignation. Holmes inclined his head. "Pray continue." Edward spoke slowly, with evident reluctance. "Some months ago I was entrusted with a set of financial records relating to a private enterprise. The details were irregular funds diverted, accounts manipulated. I did not at first realize the full extent of it, and when you did..." Holmes prompted. "I refused to proceed," said Edward. "I intended to withdraw entirely and to return the documents to their rightful authority." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "But you did not?" Edward shook his head. "I delayed. I wished to examine them more closely to be certain of what I had uncovered. And during that delay," Holmes said quietly, "someone became aware of your possession of these records." Edward looked up, his face pale. Lestrade stepped forward. "And this someone, is he the man behind all this?" Holmes answered before Edward could speak. "Yes, Inspector. I believe he is." "Then who is he?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes turned to Charles. "Perhaps Mr. Charles Markham will confirm my conclusion." Charles met his gaze. "You already know," he said. Holmes nodded. "I believe I do." He stepped into the center of the room, his voice calm but resonant. "The man we seek is one who combines financial acumen with technical ingenuity. He possesses the means to commission specialized devices, the intelligence to employ them effectively, and the audacity to orchestrate a campaign of psychological manipulation." He paused. "Such a man is not common." Lestrade frowned. "Get to the point, Holmes." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "His name is Adrian Voss." A silence fell. Edward Markham recoiled slightly. "Voss? But he is." "A respected financier," Holmes finished. "A man of considerable reputation and, as it now appears, of considerable duplicity." Lestrade's expression darkened. "I have heard the name," he said, "but there has never been any charge." "Nor will there be," Holmes interrupted, "unless we can produce evidence." He turned to Edward. "The documents you hold, do they implicate him directly?" Edward hesitated. "Yes," he said at last, "they bear his signature." Holmes nodded slowly. "Then we understand his motive. He seeks to recover or destroy those records before they can be used against him." "And the shadow?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "A means to that end. By instilling fear, he hoped to unbalance Mr. Markham, to drive him into error, perhaps even to surrender the documents willingly." Charles spoke then, his voice low. "I warned Edward," he said. "I told him he was being watched, but he would not listen." Edward turned to him. "You knew," he said, "all this time?" Charles met his gaze. "I suspected, and when the shadow began, I knew for certain." Holmes regarded him closely. "And yet you did not come forward." Charles shook his head. "Voss is not a man one confronts lightly," he said. "I hope to disrupt his plans to interfere without revealing myself." Holmes inclined his head. "A dangerous course." "Yes," said Charles, "but I had little choice." Lestrade stepped forward again. "Very well," said he. "We have a name and a motive. What we lack is proof and the man himself." Holmes smiled. "Both of which, Inspector, we shall obtain tonight." "Tonight?" I exclaimed. Holmes turned to me. "Indeed, Watson, the time for observation has passed. It is now a matter of action." He moved to the table and gathered his materials. "Mr. Markham," he said, addressing Edward, "you will return home as usual. You will behave as though nothing has changed." Edward looked alarmed. "But after what has happened—" Holmes raised a hand. "You will be under observation," he said. "You will not be alone." He turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, you will position your men discreetly around the premises. No visible presence our adversary must believe himself unobserved." Lestrade nodded. "And you?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "I shall place myself where I am least expected and most effective." He paused, then added quietly, "For tonight I believe Mr. Adrian Voss will make his move." As we prepared to depart, I could not suppress a feeling of apprehension. "You are certain of this?" I asked Holmes. He adjusted his coat, his expression composed. "My dear Watson," said he, "our adversary has invested too much in this design to abandon it now. The escalation we have witnessed, the intrusion, the message, these are the actions of a man approaching his objective. And that objective is the documents. Precisely. Holmes paused at the door. And when a man believes himself on the verge of success, he said, he becomes bold. He looked at me, his eyes bright with anticipation. Bold and therefore vulnerable. Thus it was that we set the stage for what Holmes confidently predicted would be the final act of this strange and intricate drama. The shadow had served its purpose. The players had revealed themselves, and now, in the quiet darkness of a London night, the man behind it all would step forward believing himself victorious. Little did he know that he walked not toward triumph, but into a trap laid by a mind far sharper than his own. The night the trap closed. The evening had a peculiar stillness about it, such as I have rarely known in London. The fog, which had so often been our adversary in this case, lay thinner now, more like a veil than a wall, allowing the gas lamps to burn with an uneasy clarity. Shadows still existed, of course, but they no longer concealed, they merely waited. Holmes, as we set out from Baker Street, was in a mood of restrained intensity. He spoke little, but his eyes were alert, constantly measuring, calculating, anticipating. "You expect him tonight," I said, as we turned into the street. "I do not merely expect him," Holmes replied. "I have arranged for him." There was a certainty in his tone that left little room for doubt. "And if he does not come?" I asked. Holmes gave a faint smile. "Then, Watson, I shall have misjudged a most remarkable intelligence. And I do not believe I have." Mr. Edward Markham's residence was already under discreet surveillance when we arrived. 2 plain-clothes officers were positioned at opposite corners of the street, and Lestrade himself stood within a shadowed doorway nearby, his presence deliberately unobtrusive. Edward Markham was inside, as instructed, maintaining the appearance of routine. Charles Markham had also arrived earlier, though Holmes had insisted he remain unseen, stationed in an adjacent room. "The stage is set," Lestrade murmured as we joined him. "Not yet," Holmes corrected softly. "We are still missing our principal actor." Lestrade glanced at him. "You truly believe he will come himself?" Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "A man like Voss does not delegate at the moment of resolution," he said. "He comes to see the outcome with his own eyes." We took our positions inside the house, but not in the study where Edward sat. Holmes insisted we remain in the corridor above, where a narrow stairwell allowed a concealed view of both the front entrance and the rear access. "Why here?" I whispered. Holmes leaned closer. "Because," he said quietly, "this is where he will not expect us to be." Time passed with a slow, oppressive weight. Edward Markham remained in the study below, seated at his desk, feigning calm but betraying tension in every movement. The lamp burned steadily beside him, casting long shadows across the room, shadows that, under different circumstances, might have unsettled him further. Lestrade checked his watch repeatedly. "If he is coming," he muttered, "he is taking his time." Holmes said nothing. He was watching the front door. A sound. Deliberate. A footstep upon the threshold outside. Holmes raised a single finger. The door opened, but not with force, not with haste. It opened with the confidence of someone who had been granted entry before and expected it again. A man stepped inside, tall, composed, dressed in a dark overcoat that seemed almost too plain for one of his reputed position. Adrian Voss. Even from our concealed position I felt a faint tightening in my chest. There was nothing theatrical about him. No exaggerated menace, no visible urgency. He carried himself with calm precision, the sort of man who did not need to appear dangerous in order to be so. Lestrade stiffened beside me. "That's him," he whispered. Holmes did not move. "Not yet," he murmured. "Not yet." Voss stood in the hallway listening. He was not alone in his perception of the house. He knew it was occupied. He simply did not yet know how. Downstairs, Edward Markham rose slowly from his chair. "Mr. Voss," he said, his voice controlled but strained. Voss smiled faintly. "Edward," he replied, "I trust you have reconsidered your position." Edward did not answer immediately. "I have nothing further to say," he said at last. Voss tilted his head slightly. "That is unfortunate," he said, "because I had hoped we might conclude this without unnecessary complication." From our vantage point Holmes shifted ever so slightly. Lestrade leaned in. "Shall we move?" he whispered. Holmes shook his head once. "Not yet." Voss stepped further into the room. His eyes scanned it calmly, not searching wildly, measuring, assessing. And then something changed. His gaze lingered, not on Edward, not on the desk, but on the room itself, the arrangement, the expectation, the absence of disorder. A faint smile touched his lips. "I see," he said quietly. Edward tensed. "What do you see?" he asked. Voss did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly. "You have taken precautions," he said. "That is wise." Edward's expression tightened. "I do not know what you mean." Voss sighed softly, almost sympathetically. "No," he said. "I suppose you would not—" Then he took one step forward, and stopped. Upstairs, Holmes's posture changed. His hand lifted slightly. A signal, but still not action. "Now," I whispered. "Not yet," he said. His eyes were fixed on Voss, and in that moment I understood something I had not before. Holmes was not simply waiting for Voss to arrive. He was waiting for him to commit. Voss turned slowly in the center of the room. "And the documents?" he asked. Edward hesitated. "They are not here," he said. A pause, a slight narrowing of Voss's eyes. "Then where?" he asked calmly. "Are they?" Edward did not answer, but in that silence something subtle occurred. Voss understood, and in understanding, he accepted it. "Now," Holmes said sharply. Everything happened at once. Lestrade moved. I followed. Footsteps thundered down the stairs, but even before we reached the lower hall, Voss was already moving, not toward escape, not toward panic, but toward the side door, as though he had known all along where every exit was. Holmes reached the landing just in time to see the door swing open. Voss stepped into the night, and vanished into the fog. "After him," Lestrade shouted. But Holmes did not immediately follow. Instead, he stood at the threshold, his eyes narrowed not with frustration but with something far more unsettling. Recognition. We pursued into the street. The fog had thickened again, swallowing the lamps in dull halos of light. Footsteps echoed, then faded, then reappeared in impossible directions. Voss moved like a man who knew the city intimately, too intimately. "He's heading east," Lestrade called. "No," Holmes said quietly. "He is leading us." We turned a corner. Nothing. Another. Nothing. And then, complete. Absence of movement, absence of direction, absence of man. Lestrade swore under his breath. "He's gone." But Holmes remained still. His eyes were fixed upon the fog ahead. "No," he said softly. "He has simply completed his purpose here." I turned to him. "What purpose?" Holmes did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than before. "To confirm something," he said. Lestrade frowned. "Confirm what?" Holmes slowly lowered his gaze. "That he was expected." A pause. "And that we were prepared." My blood ran slightly cold. "You mean—" Holmes turned slightly toward the darkness where Voss had vanished. "I mean," he said, "that tonight was never intended to capture him." He paused. "It was intended to show him something?" Lestrade stared. "Show him what?" Holmes's expression hardened. "A weakness." The realization settled heavily upon me. The trap had not closed upon Voss, not in the way we had assumed. It had been observed, studied, and tested, and as Holmes stood there in the fog, I saw something in his face that I had rarely seen before. Not doubt, not confusion, but calculation sharpened by a new and unwelcome possibility. For the first time in this case, Sherlock Holmes had not controlled the final outcome. He had merely participated in it. And somewhere in the fog ahead, Adrian Voss had already understood exactly what that meant. The countermove. The silence that followed Voss's disappearance was not the silence of resolution, but of disruption. It lingered in the air like an unfinished sentence, one that refused to resolve itself into meaning. We returned to Baker Street in a state of subdued tension. Lestrade, though unwilling to admit it openly, was visibly unsettled. Edward Markham sat in a chair near the fire, staring into it as though it might yield some explanation if observed long enough. Charles remained standing by the window, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. Holmes, however, was the only one among us who appeared outwardly composed, but I knew him too well to be deceived by composure alone. He had withdrawn into thought, and when Holmes withdrew into thought, it was never a passive state, it was preparation for something decisive. "Well," Lestrade said at last, breaking the uneasy quiet he escaped. Cleanly. Holmes did not respond immediately. He stood with his back to the room, hands clasped behind him, gaze fixed on the darkened street outside. "Yes," he said finally. "He escaped." Edward lifted his head. "Then it is over?" he asked faintly. Holmes turned slightly. "No," he said. "It has only changed form." Charles Markham's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Holmes crossed the room slowly. "What we witnessed tonight was not failure," he said. "It was assessment." Lestrade frowned. "Assessment of what?" Holmes stopped beside the mantel. Of us, a silence followed. Edward gave a nervous laugh. "That is absurd," he said. "Why would he need to assess us? He already knows." "Knows what?" Holmes interrupted gently. Edward hesitated. "That we are trying to stop him." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. He turned to face us fully, and now he knows how we attempt it." I felt a chill at those words. "You mean he anticipated the trap?" I asked. Holmes's expression tightened slightly. "I mean," he said carefully, "that he allowed himself to be seen entering it." Lestrade, "That's nonsense. No man walks into a police operation willingly." Holmes's eyes flicked toward him. "A man does not walk into a trap willingly," he agreed. "Unless the trap is not designed to catch him but to reveal those who set it." The implication hung heavily in the air. Edward paled. "So you are saying—" "We were observed?" Holmes nodded once. Charles spoke quietly. "Then he knows you were here." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "More importantly," he said, "he knows how we were here." Lestrade frowned. "I don't follow." Holmes turned. "Consider the positioning, the timing, the concealment of my men, the use of Markham as bait. Every element of our arrangement was visible to him in that brief moment." A pause. "And now he understands our method." I felt unease settle deeper. "And what does that mean?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was lower. "It means," he said, "that the initiative has shifted." For the first time since the case had begun, Holmes left Baker Street that night without informing us of his destination. I attempted to accompany him, but he stopped me at the door. "No, Watson," he said, "not this time." "And why not?" His eyes met mine. "Because," he said, "this is no longer observation." A pause. "It is counterplay." Before I could respond further, he was gone into the fog. The following morning brought no clarity, only escalation. A message arrived at Baker Street addressed to Holmes. It was delivered by a street boy who claimed it had been placed in his hand by a man he could not describe clearly, only that he wore a dark coat and walked as if he knew where everything was already. Holmes returned shortly thereafter and read the note in silence. When he finished, he placed it on the table. "What is it?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. Lestrade, who had arrived earlier, leaned forward. "Well?" Holmes finally spoke. "A warning," he said. Edward stiffened. "From Voss?" Holmes nodded once. Lestrade scoffed. "A criminal sending warnings to Holmes? That's new." Holmes turned the note toward us. "It reads," he said quietly, "You have learned my method." A pause. "Now I will show you my intention." Silence filled the room. Edward looked increasingly pale. "What does he mean?" he whispered. Holmes's expression was grave. "He means," he said, "that the shadow was never the objective." Lestrade frowned. "Then what was?" Holmes looked at him directly. "The shadow," he said, "was a demonstration." A pause. "A proof of concept." That afternoon Holmes began moving with unusual urgency. He visited the alley once more, then the optical supplier again. He sent telegrams, questioned witnesses, and examined records with a speed that suggested time itself had become an adversary. I accompanied him through much of this, though he remained distant, absorbed. At last, late in the day, he stopped abruptly in the street. "That is it," he said. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes turned to me. "The pattern is complete." I frowned. "What pattern?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he spoke slowly. "Every act in this case has served a dual purpose," he said. "To affect Mr. Markham and to teach us." I stared at him. "To teach us what?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "How he thinks—" We returned to Baker Street, where Lestrade and the Markham brothers awaited us. Holmes entered without hesitation. "I require absolute attention," he said immediately. Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "That sounds serious." "It is," Holmes replied. He placed a series of notes on the table. "Adrian Voss is not merely protecting himself," he said. "He is constructing something." Edward leaned forward. "Constructing what?" Holmes looked at him. "A sequence." Charles spoke quietly. "For what purpose?" Holmes paused. A silence fell. Then Holmes added, "And we are already inside it." I felt a growing unease as Holmes laid out his reasoning. Voss had not reacted to us as criminals typically do. He had not fled permanently. He had not escalated recklessly. Instead, each response had been measured, educational, deliberate, as though every interaction was part of a larger design we could not yet see in full. Lestrade finally broke the silence. "So what now?" Holmes looked at him steadily. "Now," he said, "we stop reacting." A pause. "And begin anticipating him." He turned toward the window. "For if Voss has been teaching us," he said quietly, Then I intend to learn faster than he expects." That night Holmes made a decision that unsettled even Lestrade. We would abandon passive observation entirely. Instead, we would strike at Voss's structure note the man himself, but the network that sustained him, his resources, his contacts, his supply chain of devices, information, and manipulation. "We cannot catch a shadow," Holmes said, "but we can extinguish its sources of light." And so began the next phase of the case. Not pursuit, not defense, but dismantling. Yet as I observed Holmes that evening, poring over maps and records with relentless focus, I could not escape a growing sense of unease. For it seemed to me that in attempting to understand Adrian Voss, Holmes was not merely pursuing an enemy. He was entering into a contest of minds so finely balanced that even a single miscalculation might shift everything irrevocably. And somewhere beyond our reach I was certain of one thing. Voss was already preparing the next move, and it would not be defensive. It would be decisive.